You were never supposed to hear this story. In fact, if you close this video right now, no one would blame you. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't the kind of tale that sits comfortably in the mind. It infects it. Imagine a family, ordinary on the surface, living in a quiet American town. Their name, the Follings. But nothing about them was ordinary. Over several decades, this family took in children, not one, not two, but 21. All of them were orphans, or so it was said. Yet every single one of those children came with a shadow. No traceable birth certificate, no official paper trail, as if they had been plucked out of existence before they could even be recognized as real. You're probably asking yourself, how is that possible in America, the land of records and paperwork? The answer is where the nightmare begins. The first whispers about the Follings came not from journalists, not from police, but from neighbors. They spoke of silence inside that house. Not the normal quiet of a home, but a stillness so heavy it felt wrong, like walking into a chapel at midnight. The children rarely left. On the rare occasion they did, their eyes looked strange, unfocused, as though they weren't entirely there. And each time someone tried to speak to them, they would glance nervously at the Folling parents before offering a reply that felt rehearsed, robotic, almost as if someone had drilled it into their heads. This wasn't just adoption. This was control. And yet the authorities, when tipped off, found nothing, because officially those children did not exist. No names, no paperwork, no questions. How could an entire family operate in plain sight, yet remain untouchable? The secret begins to reveal itself when you follow the money. The Follings were not wealthy people, not by any normal means. They didn't have sprawling businesses or visible streams of income. Yet their home was maintained, their pantry was full, and 21 mouths were somehow fed year after year. Buried in archived financial records lies the first piece of proof. Anonymous wire transfers, funneled through charities that no longer exist. These charities were shells, fronts for something larger, older, and darker. You see, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a network of religious industrial organizations experimented with unregistered children, human beings deliberately removed from the state's eyes, so they could be raised outside the reach of law. Some were groomed for labor, others for psychological experiments, and a few for rituals most people wouldn't dare imagine. The Follings, it appears, were part of this hidden system. But here's where it turns darker still. The children weren't just nameless. They were numbers. Testimonies from a former housemaid, buried in a forgotten county archive, describe how each child was given an internal code. A number sewn secretly into their clothing. A number etched in chalk above their beds. To the Follings, the children were not sons or daughters. They were entries in a ledger, subjects in an experiment that went back generations. The maid wrote of whispered prayers at midnight, not the kind you'd hear in church, but guttural chants in a language she couldn't identify. Sometimes the children were forced to stand in circles for hours, repeating words they didn't understand. Words that sounded less like worship and more like invocation. These weren't orphans saved. These were vessels being prepared. And yet, when you trace the story back even further, you uncover something even more disturbing. The Follings themselves, Albert and Ruth, were not who they claimed to be. They too appeared from nowhere. No birth records, no census entries before a certain date, as though they had simply materialized. Some researchers believe the Follings weren't just participants. They were products of the very same system. Raised in shadows, taught in secrecy, trained to continue the cycle. That would explain their coldness, their precision, their almost ritualistic obsession with secrecy. But the real question is, where did this system come from? Who created it? And why? Because if you follow the trail carefully enough, the fingerprints don't just belong to one family. They belong to institutions of power, the kind that write history, not just follow it. And those fingerprints are still there, waiting to be seen. Every great lie hides in plain sight. And the Follings' secret was no different. In family photographs, they looked like every other American household, stiff smiles, pressed clothing, Sunday portraits in front of lace curtains. But if you study those photos closely, something gnaws at you. The children never smiled. Not one. Their posture is rigid, their eyes hollow, as though someone had drained the life out of them before the picture was even taken. Neighbors thought it was just the strictness of a religious household. But silence isn't piety, it's programming. Behind the image of normalcy was a system designed to erase individuality, to mold children into tools. And the real horror isn't that this happened once in one house. The horror is how many families like the Follings existed, scattered across states, all linked by the same invisible hand. One chilling detail emerges in the 1930s, when a social worker tried to investigate. Her notes, barely legible now, describe something unnatural about the Follings children. She wrote, "They do not answer questions directly. They wait. They look at each other as if deciding who should speak. When one talks, the others follow in the exact same rhythm, as though they are reciting from the same invisible page." This was not just discipline. This was conditioning. Imagine 21 human beings raised like a single hive. Stripped of identity, stripped of memory, fused into something collective. That social worker died before she could publish her findings. Officially it was an accident, an automobile crash. But buried in her final pages is one last phrase: "They're not raising children, they're constructing replacements." The word replacement should send a chill down your spine. Because here's where the story takes a turn. Among old town ledgers, historians discovered records of missing children from neighboring counties, vanishings that never made headlines because families were poor, powerless, unheard. Cross-reference the timelines and you find something sinister. Many of those disappearances line up exactly with the years the Follings adopted. 21 children, each arriving after another, vanished. Were the Follings handpicked to collect these lost souls? Or were they simply the visible edge of a much larger machine? One that plucked unwanted lives from the cracks of society and rewired them for hidden purposes? The official narrative of adoption collapses when you see this pattern. These weren't rescues. They were acquisitions. But here's a question no one dares to ask. Why erase the paper trail? Why strip a child of a birth certificate, of their name, of their very existence? Because when someone has no history, they belong entirely to whoever controls them. No government, no church, no extended family could intervene. These children became blanks, living ghosts onto which the Follings could write whatever story they desired. And this practice wasn't just convenient for one family. It was strategic. Across history, institutions of power have thrived on the nameless, the undocumented, the unclaimed. From foundling homes in Europe to labor camps in America, the nameless become clay, molded, used, discarded. The Follings were simply one manifestation of an ancient principle. Control begins when identity is erased. And once you see that pattern, you start noticing how it repeats even today. If you're still here, you've already crossed a line. Because the deeper we go, the more dangerous the knowledge becomes. At this point, the story is no longer about one twisted family, it's about a hidden architecture of control. Think of it like a stage play. The Follings were actors, but the script was written elsewhere. Every chant, every ritual, every wire transfer hinted at something larger, an order older than the family itself. This is where researchers stumble upon the term whispered in archives, the orphan code. A phrase so rare it only appears in a handful of declassified papers. It referred to the practice of raising children without state recognition, indoctrinating them, and inserting them into society as invisible instruments. 21 children weren't just victims, they were assets. And once you grasp that, you can't help but wonder, where did those assets end up? Who did they become? And what are they doing now? When researchers traced the Follings paper trail, they expected dead ends. Instead, they uncovered something worse: deliberate redirects. Adoption agencies that didn't exist, charity groups that vanished a year after filing paperwork, and church missions with names that appeared in multiple counties yet left no physical records behind. The pattern looked random until one archivist mapped the locations onto a larger chart. Each address formed a web, nodes of activity surrounding major industrial hubs, especially those connected to railroads and textile factories. The implication is chilling. The Follings weren't just raising children in silence. They were raising replacements for labor systems, controlled networks of human beings trained outside the state's reach. But when children became commodities, you have to ask, what else were they being used for? Whispers of ritual continue to haunt this story. A priest stationed near the Follings town during the 1940s left behind a diary, later recovered by a distant relative. His notes describe late-night sounds, not laughter, not arguments, but chanting that rose and fell like waves. He wrote, "They are teaching the young ones something older than Scripture." The diary mentions smoke, symbols carved into barn walls, and children standing motionless in a circle under the moonlight. He never dared confront the family, but one entry stands out: they pray not to God, but through the children. If true, it suggests the children weren't simply being raised, they were being weaponized as vessels for something beyond comprehension. Whether ritualistic theater or genuine invocation, the effect on those children was permanent. The psychological conditioning of the children shows in chilling consistency. A rare interview with one survivor, located decades later under a different name, offers a glimpse into the damage. She described being told repeatedly that she had no past, that her first memory was the only real one. When asked what that memory was, she replied, "The circle." Every child began their life in the family by standing in that ritual circle, repeating words they didn't understand until they believed them. Imagine your childhood stripped of bedtime stories, birthday candles, or even a name. Imagine instead being told that your worth existed only in service to something unseen. That was the reality of the Follings children. And here's the darker part. This conditioning was not unique. It mirrored government-backed psychological programs decades later, programs that sought to erase memory, rebuild identity, and create malleable human beings. It's here we stumble on the most disturbing overlap. Institutions that were supposed to protect children seemed to protect the Follings instead. Each time a report surfaced, neglect, unusual behavior, suspicions of ritual, the paperwork vanished. Sheriffs dismissed concerns. Judges signed off on guardianship renewals without question. It was as if an invisible hand shielded the family, ensuring they could continue their work uninterrupted. But this was not incompetence. It was complicity. Once you understand that, you begin to see how power structures manipulate from the shadows. The Follings weren't immune to oversight because of luck. They were immune because they served a function. The nameless children were not just hidden, they were sanctioned. And so the question grows heavier: who sanctioned it? Who allowed an American family to adopt 21 children without records, and why? The first clue lies in a set of declassified documents from the early Cold War. The papers describe an off-the-books experiment involving children without prior state imprinting. The theory was simple and horrifying. A child without a recorded past could be written upon like a blank slate, easier to manipulate, easier to erase. One chilling phrase stands out: a life unrecorded can be repurposed at will. Suddenly, the Follings were no longer an isolated family, they were part of an early template for psychological control. And here's where you need to listen carefully. History is written by those who need you to forget. But families like the Follings? They were designed to ensure forgetting happened at the human level. To grasp the full scale of what the Follings were part of, we need to look at the churches. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, religious institutions were not just spiritual hubs, they were engines of social control. Foundling homes, orphanages, and charity missions often acted as funnels for children with no records. What looked like mercy was often machinery. The Follings were tied, through financial donations, to a local parish that reported directly to a larger diocese notorious for losing paperwork on children. Each missing document was not an error, it was erasure. And once a child's name vanished, they belonged to whoever held them. The church kept its hands clean, the families absorbed the silence, and the children became shadows. If this sounds like conspiracy, remember, archives don't lie. Missing names aren't random, they are patterns. But the Follings were more than caretakers. They were custodians of ritual knowledge. Documents found in a county auction reveal a strange leather-bound book once owned by Albert Folling himself. The book contains notations in 2 languages, one English, the other indecipherable. Inside are diagrams of circles, phrases repeated like mantras, and lists of numbers. Next to each number, a date. Next to each date, a child's first day in the household. One researcher noted the precision. The numbers were not random but aligned with astrological cycles. Imagine that. Each child's arrival wasn't chance. It was scheduled, orchestrated, timed to forces the average person would never consider. Were the Follings simply deranged, or were they following instructions handed down by something larger than themselves? By the 1950s, government agencies began experimenting openly with psychological conditioning, programs like Macabre. But the Follings predate those projects, and therein lies the key. It wasn't that the Follings mirrored government experiments, it's that the government mirrored them. Unrecorded children provided the perfect prototype. Subjects no one would look for, no files to trace, no families to protest. Testimonies from ex-officials decades later admit that rural family units were occasionally seated with nameless children to test obedience training, memory suppression, and ritualized learning. What the Follings were doing quietly in their home was later systematized on a national scale. This isn't speculation, it's blueprint. The most disturbing connection emerges when you examine where those children went. In a classified court record, one survivor recounted being relocated at age 14. He described being placed in a boarding school run by a wealthy patron. But the school wasn't in state records. No address matched its description. He said the students were trained to memorize codes, recite foreign languages, and forget everything personal. They told us our past was a dream, he whispered. And when I asked about my name, they laughed. This wasn't adoption. It was harvesting. The children didn't grow up into normal adults. They were funneled into systems. Some into labor, some into experiments, and some into roles we can't even begin to trace. Pause here and let this sink in. 21 children with no birth certificates means 21 lives deliberately unmoored from reality. They could be inserted anywhere, into corporations, military units, or religious orders, and no one would question their origins. That's the power of erasure. And here's where I need you, the viewer, to do something. If you followed this descent so far, type the phrase, "I am not nameless," twice in the comments below. This is more than engagement, it's identity reclamation. It marks the moment you refuse to be erased, the moment you declare yourself more than a blank slate. Because what the Follings did to those children is still being done on a larger, quieter scale today. And only those who see it can resist it. Money always leaves a trail, even when hidden. Financial records uncovered decades later show the Follings received anonymous donations from trusts tied to wealthy industrial families. Names that appear in oil, railroads, and banking. These weren't random philanthropists. They were the same dynasties funding universities, research hospitals, and churches. Their pattern is consistent. Investment in institutions that shape thought, education, and belief. So why fund a family in a quiet county with 21 untraceable children? Because those children weren't just dependents. They were assets, hidden investments. Imagine growing your wealth not in dollars, but in minds raised to obey, to infiltrate, to serve. The Follings weren't an anomaly, they were a pilot program. In one particularly chilling document, a banker's ledger from 1929 lists human capital reserves. At first glance, it looks like a clerical error. But each reserve matches the timeline of a Folling child entering the household. Numbers, not names. Dates, not birthdays. It suggests a partnership between financial elites and families like the Follings. These children weren't only hidden from society, they were commodified, quantified, and assigned value. A chilling phrase scribbled in the margin reads, "Exchanges must remain unrecorded." To the outside world they were orphans. To the system they were currency. And then comes the revelation that should shake you. A portion of these nameless children were eventually inserted into institutions of influence, military, church, education, even politics. Without a birth certificate, they could assume new identities created on demand. They became living placeholders, shadows given shape by those who controlled the paperwork. One congressional aide, decades later, admitted privately, "Some of the people you trust the most, the ones you see on stages and pulpits, were never born, at least not officially." Think about that. A person with no past can be written into any narrative, and you would never know. The Follings' 21 children may not have disappeared. They may have become part of the structure around you. The ritual component was never about superstition. It was about programming. Symbols, chants, and cycles weren't just for belief, they were for imprinting. Ancient techniques of repetition and rhythm have always been used to condition the mind. Combine that with the erasure of identity, and you create something terrifying. Human beings who no longer recognize the boundary between their own will and their handler's instructions. Survivors of such conditioning describe the same sensations. A buzzing in the ears, a feeling of leaving their own body, and then obedience, total, unquestioned obedience. The Follings weren't raising children. They were sculpting vessels. And vessels, once emptied, can be filled with anything. Here's the moment most people look away. Because the deeper question is not who the Follings were, but who you are. If entire lives can be erased, rewritten, and repurposed, what makes you different? Your records? Your history? Do you even know who wrote those? The institutions that crafted families like the Follings are the same ones that crafted the identity systems we rely on now. Birth certificates, licenses, passports, they aren't proofs of who you are. They're chains that tie you to a system that decides when you exist and when you don't. The Follings' children were erased at the beginning. The rest of us? We're erased at the end. And the gap between the two is what we call life. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. The survivors' voices are fractured, like broken glass reflecting 100 different images of the same nightmare. One woman, tracked down in the 1970s, claimed she remembered waking up in different houses, always being told it was her first day. She said the rituals blurred into dreams until she believed her own memories were false. Another survivor described the silence of meals. No one allowed to speak until a bell rang. He confessed that even decades later, he couldn't eat in a restaurant without hearing that phantom bell in his mind. Trauma didn't just haunt them, it rewired them. Each survivor spoke of the same emptiness, the loss of a self that never had a chance to exist. And yet, in fragments, their testimonies align into one terrible truth: the Follings were not alone. In scattered towns across America, other families were reported to have adopted multiple children, always with questionable paperwork, always shrouded in secrecy. Some had 6, others 9, but the pattern was unmistakable. These weren't eccentric households, they were cells. Each cell operated under the same doctrine: erase the past, condition the present, control the future. And who oversaw them? Not local law, not social services, but networks hidden beneath charities, religious orders, and philanthropic societies. The Follings were the most extreme example, but not the only one. Which forces you to ask, how many nameless children walked among us, never recognized, never recorded, molded into something unnatural? The second-generation evidence is perhaps the most haunting. A researcher in the 1990s stumbled upon a man who claimed to be the son of one of the original Follings children. His words chilled her. "My mother never spoke of her past, only that she was borrowed." He explained that her conditioning passed to him in subtler ways: rituals she couldn't stop repeating, phrases she whispered in her sleep. Trauma doesn't just die, it bleeds into the next generation. And when those children grow up, they unknowingly continue the cycle. The nameless don't vanish, they multiply, spreading the doctrine without even realizing it. The Follings may have died, but their shadow seeded itself into bloodlines. Suppressed testimonies show how these survivors were later recruited. Some were absorbed into covert programs. Others were used as test subjects in universities, volunteers they called them, but what choice did they ever have? One chilling document reveals that unrecorded children were perfect candidates for ghost employment. Jobs with no tax history, no records, no accountability. They could be used, replaced, and erased again. One survivor recounted being given a new name every 3 years. Imagine living an entire life as a sequence of masks, never once knowing which face was your own. That's not survival, that's perpetual captivity. And here is the secret almost no one dares to confront. This system never ended. It simply changed names. Adoption scandals in the 20th century, missing paperwork in state institutions, lost children in foster systems. Each echoes the same pattern the Follings perfected. Namelessness as control. It's easy to look at their 21 children as a dark chapter long closed. But open your eyes and you'll see it continues today, just hidden beneath modern bureaucracy. Thousands of children still disappear from records every year, and the excuse is always the same: clerical error. But there are no errors that consistent. The Folling shadow never vanished. It adapted. And the question becomes, how many more families like them still operate, shielded by the very institutions we trust? When you pull the curtain back far enough, the face you see staring back is not a family, it's the institution itself. The Follings were tolerated, even protected, because their work aligned with higher agendas. Court cases vanish, documents burn, witnesses disappear. That is not coincidence. That is design. The truth is, institutions have always required a pool of the nameless, the unclaimed, the erased. Armies need soldiers no one will miss. Industries need workers who don't complain. Secret programs need subjects who have no family to bury them. The Follings were never aberrations. They were the template. And the deeper horror is this: the system still needs them today. If you want proof of continuity, look no further than the state foster systems of the 20th century. Records show thousands of children lost between transfers, paperwork delayed, signatures missing, entire files disappearing. Some of those children reappeared years later with new names. Others? Never again. Activists tried to investigate, but each time they ran into the same wall. Missing files, sealed cases, bureaucratic fog. Sound familiar? It is the same pattern we saw with the Follings. Erasure followed by control. Officially, these are oversights. But patterns repeated over decades are not mistakes. They are procedures. What makes this more insidious is how invisible it becomes. When a child grows up with no record, no name, no identity, they vanish into the cracks of history. You never hear of them again because officially they never existed. And this, ironically, gives institutions the ultimate tool: deniability. They can create lives, repurpose them, and erase them at will. The Follings children were not simply victims. They were prototypes. And today, the same blueprint allows governments, corporations, and shadow networks to operate entire programs in silence. The tools have changed: databases, digital records, biometric scans, but the principle remains: he who controls identity controls the human being. And so I speak directly to you now. If you're still watching, understand this: you've crossed the threshold. You've seen the cracks in the facade, and that knowledge will never leave you. The Follings are long dead, but the shadow they served is alive, breathing through every system you trust. Schools, churches, bureaucracies, they shape you not just by what they give, but by what they take, your sense of who you are. That's why you must guard your name, your history, your memory. Because if they can erase that, they can remake you into anything. That's what they did to the children. That's what they've tried to do to all of us. And this, right here, is where resistance begins. Before we move into the final revelations, I need you to do something. If you're finding yourself drawn deeper into this forbidden story, subscribe to this channel right now. Not for numbers, not for vanity, but because every time you come back here, you step further outside the official narrative and closer to truth. And YouTube's algorithm will bury this unless you fight back by locking yourself in. Subscribing is not just a click. It's a declaration that you refuse to be erased. The Follings raised children who never had a voice. You do. Use it. Because the final chapters I'm about to reveal will not only expose what happened to those 21 children, but how their legacy is shaping your life in ways you can't yet see. So where did the 21 children go? That question has haunted researchers for decades. Some vanished into institutions that no longer exist. Some were buried under new identities, planted in positions of influence. And some simply disappeared. A rare testimony from a government archivist admits that certain names were manufactured to fill vacancies. In plain words, these children became placeholders. Teachers, soldiers, pastors, even officials, lives built entirely on fabricated foundations. When their usefulness ended, the trail collapsed and no one could prove they had ever lived. This is the power of a nameless beginning. It allows a life to be written and erased like chalk on a blackboard. And that means some of the Follings children may have brushed shoulders with you, without you ever realizing what they truly were. The conditioning they endured didn't stop in childhood. Records hint at continued reinforcement. Survivors describe being summoned back to gatherings in adulthood, where familiar chants, symbols, and cycles were repeated. One man described the sensation as keys fitting into locks inside my head. He said he would forget himself, lose his will, and awaken hours later unsure of what he had done. This is not mere trauma, it is programming with triggers. Think of it, entire human beings built with switches that could be flipped by the right command. The Follings weren't raising orphans, they were manufacturing operatives. Invisible citizens, controlled lives. And once you see that, you realize the program's real value, the creation of human beings who belonged entirely to the system. The modern parallels are impossible to ignore. Today we speak of identity theft, lost data, and hacked databases. But the principle is identical to the Follings legacy. Control identity, control the person. Now it happens digitally at scale. Entire populations reduced to numbers, tags, profiles. You think you own your name, your history, but a database can rewrite you at the press of a key. That's not progress. That's perfection of the same system the Follings once served. The nameless child has become the tagged citizen, the controlled consumer, the programmable subject. And if you think you're free because you can scroll or choose or vote, remember the Follings children believed they had choices too. Until they realized every choice was scripted. So what is the lesson buried in this nightmare? It is not only that a family in a quiet town once raised 21 children without birth certificates. It is that erasure is power. The nameless become vessels. And institutions, churches, governments, corporations, have always needed vessels. The Follings story is not an isolated horror, it is a mirror. It forces you to ask, who are you really? Who gave you your name? Who keeps your records? And what happens when those records vanish? The line between you and the nameless child is thinner than you want to believe. And once you see it, the comfort of ignorance is gone forever. This is the end of the story, but not the end of the shadow. The Follings are dead, their house long abandoned, but their legacy lives on in every erased file, every lost child, every manipulated record. You've walked with me through the silence of their rituals, the emptiness in their children's eyes, and the machinery that protected them. Now you face a choice. Pretend this was just a story, a ghost of history. Or accept it for what it is, a blueprint still in use. If you choose the latter, you can never go back. You are no longer innocent. And so, I'll ask you one last time. Type, I am not nameless twice in the comments. Not for me. For you. To mark the moment you became untouchable, the moment you refuse the erasure. Because the greatest act of rebellion against systems of control is to know who you are, and never let them take it away.